People struggling with debt deal with stress every day. Worrying about how they're going to deal with it can have a significant impact on their mental health, their lives, and their relationships. That's why in this episode of the podcast, I talked with Dr. Erika Rasure, a financial therapist with a doctorate in personal financial planning, on how to deal with this stress in a positive way. My guest today is Dr. Erika Rasure, a former financial advisor and university professor turned financial therapist who has helped thousands of people approach their finances in more intentional, healthy ways. She serves as chief financial wellness advisor at Beyond Finance, where she meets weekly with hundreds of clients working their way out of debt and towards financial freedom. In addition to her work at Beyond Finance, Dr. Erika serves as chair of the research board for the Financial Therapy Clinical Institute. She's a member of the Financial Review Board for Investopedia, The Balance, Very Well Family, and Very Well Parents. Her insight and interviews have been featured in national outlets such as Barron's, CNN, Forbes, Fox Business, Market Watch, NBC News Now, USA Today, and Yahoo. Dr. Erika holds a doctorate in personal financial planning from Kansas State University and is a certified deep transformational coach, an accreditation that surrounds changing patterns in actions and behavior. She addresses holistic wellness in her treatment, incorporating the practice of yoga. She's also a registered yoga teacher into her comprehensive approach to financial therapy. Welcome to the show, Dr. Erika.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's good to talk, and I have done this subject in previous episodes, or one episode with a psychologist where we talked about the stress and anxiety and things like that that debt can bring about, and how to address it. But like anything else, there are many ways up the mountain, and I'm sure you have your way as much as Dr. Wyman did in my interview with him. So let's talk about that. You know, dealing with debt, and I've seen that in my bankruptcy practice, it can be very stressful. And as I said, I've talked about this topic with other guests, but I wanted to get your approach, as I said. Let's start with a basis. What do you see as being the most common mental health challenges that face those with debt?
Yeah, I do. I meet with hundreds of clients a week. I do group financial therapy sessions, and even in my individual, practice with my one-on-ones, it's the spiral of anxiety and depression and avoidant behaviors. And you even start to see those physical symptoms like poor sleep or the headaches, the tummy aches, all of those things. And it really has to do with the enormous weight that debt carries on someone, and that is shame and isolation. Those are the two things that really kind of are the gateways into this stress, this anxiety, this depression. They begin to believe that their debt defines their worth, and that becomes extremely problematic, because debt really does erode someone's sense of identity, and it takes away not just money in the pocketbook in the traditional sense, but it takes away from their sense of self, their sense of self-efficacy, and their trust in themselves.
Mhm. And certainly, as you know, their responsibilities to their family. I mean, it's not only self worth, but in the family situation, they're the breadwinner. They're the ones that are responsible for taking care of the family and making sure that there's food on the table and everything else, and they can afford to live. And that not only themselves and their spouses, but also their children. Do you find that people with children uh, have any additional stress or different types of stress that they go through because of that?
I would say, speaking as a mother of four, children are their own level of stress to begin with. And but I would say by and large, yes. When you are responsible for people, little people, in particular, that is a whole next level of weight and pressure that you feel on your shoulders, not just the shame and the isolation and the anxiety and the stress, but you worry about their well-being, you worry about what you can and cannot do for them. Enter the parental guilt. And when that enters the equation, that's when things can really start to unravel quickly, in terms of the parental mental health.
Mhm. And obviously, you have, I mean, debt is stressful, trying to pay the bills, things like that. And at one time or another, I'm sure all of us have gone through stressful times because of just trying to make ends meet or pay the bills. But these people have actually sought treatment.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can only imagine that this goes way beyond what most of us feel, the stress that we feel, that they've actually reached out and said, I need help. What do you see as that tipping point? If there's somebody in among our listeners that's feeling this kind of stress, when is it that they should say, maybe I should see someone about this?
Absolutely. I think one of the tipping points is, this extreme feeling of isolation.
Hmm.
It's hard to talk about money for most people when money is good, right? We're not often like discussing our big Christmas bonus or annual bonus or our dividends, at the table with our friends. And so we're certainly not going to be discussing, our financial challenges with others if money's not so good. And so that weight, that pressure begins to build. And that's usually what I see is the tipping point is they're like, I cannot do this by myself anymore. And for people who are able to do that and go get that help in just kind of a general environment that I it's changing and there are so many positive steps forward, but truly we still live in a society where money is not openly talked about, and our challenges, particularly when it comes to debt, those things are kept hush hush. And so the people who do seek help are the ones who, in my experience, have just felt this pressure, this weight becomes too overwhelming, but they also share that common thread of some courage and bravery and that willingness to get the help, which is I think everything in this process.
When you talk about a sense of isolation, where would you say that, when someone realizes they can't deal with this on their own,
Yes.
they need to, whether it's on their own or, if your spouse is in this kind of the same boat you are, so really talking it out with your spouse doesn't help. I guess the isolation can be within that family. Certainly
Absolutely.
don't share that with your children, so you share that with your spouse. But when you realize that you by yourself or you and your spouse can no longer cope and feel like you need to talk to someone else about it.
Yes, yes. And debt is interesting because, debt can often make you feel like you're on an island where it's just you or you and your spouse, and that there are very few people out there who can relate to. But the fact of the matter is, and this is something I've been doing this for 21 years at this point, you know, and I say this all of the time, debt doesn't discriminate. Everybody is just, one major life event away from a devastating, financial event, whether that's, death or divorce or maybe a major health issue. I mean, you run the gamut on that. But once people start to realize that, hey, there are more people out there like them, that also adds a little bit of the okay, I'm not alone component. And that is something I emphasize to all of the clients I work with is you are not alone. And I always congratulate them and ask them to celebrate the fact that they made it to me. They made it to a place where they are getting some assistance so they don't feel like they're alone. Because the one thing that keeps me up at night is thinking about all of the people who are going through what they're going through and aren't getting the help,
Mhm.
and because there are far more of them than the people I see.
Well, it's not only communication and just talking to someone about it, an objective third party, but you talk about this sense of shame and everything. And I see this all the time in my bankruptcy practice. And this one woman, she just got her discharge and she was in my office just practically crying because she's so ashamed of herself. I'm more responsible than this. I shouldn't have gotten into this debt. This is all my fault. And I said, look, you know, it happens. Sometimes, I walked her through a little bit on a lot of the external forces that that are acted on her and act on a lot of other people. And sometimes I'll say to them, look, I'm not going to deny that there have been a few people in my office I've wanted to slap around and say, what are you, an idiot? But I said, but the vast majority of them are just people that they lost a job, they became disabled, they had a large unexpected expense that they ended up putting on the credit cards and it became snowballed from there. And sometimes I'll say, you know, I said, I don't know whether this makes you feel any better, but you have about $25,000 in debt and credit cards. I've seen six figures. I've seen over 100, sometimes 200,000. And I said, you think you're in a hole? I said, like I said, I don't know whether it makes you feel better or not, but there are a lot of other people that are in your situation that got into it through no fault of their own or circumstances beyond their control. And I've seen in their eyes that they tend to relax. And I think, and you would agree that just hearing, look, and getting forgiveness, it's like I'm a Catholic, so you go to confession and
You're
you say,
right.
and you have someone sitting there that says, I forgive you. You're forgiven. And that weight, you know, and but just to say that and say, that's okay. A lot of people go through this. This is not unusual. You've done the right thing. You begin at a fresh start. And then I talk to them about this is what you need to do to make sure you keep that fresh start
Yeah.
and get them into good habits. And that's one of the reasons why I do this podcast. But
Yeah.
certainly getting rid of that guilt, right?
Yeah. And that guilt is very pervasive. And I do, and it's funny that you made the analogy to, going to confession, and also a Catholic here, but one of the things I tell my clients is, people often feel like they have to pay penance, the entire time they're going through a debt situation, that they are locked into a debt prison. And it really does give them this sense of tunnel vision, and
Mm-hmm.
there's so many other aspects of your personal financial foundation that are important that often don't get the attention they need, or even your personal attention, because you are so focused on the debt, and it's
Mm-hmm.
stressful, it's anxiety inducing, it's all of these things. And when you don't know where to go or what to do, and you've got the voices of the important grown-ups in your life that told you that, your worth is, your credit score number. We make our payments on time, and if you don't, you're a bad person. There's all that guilt that they're rumbling with, in addition to trying to take care of the debt itself. And so it becomes like this prison. And I think one of the biggest barriers to anybody trying to get out of that is not seeking that forgiveness, letting themselves let go of the expectations of financial institutions or other people that have put their values onto them as they navigate a life challenge that has led to a financial challenge. It's I think, however you're getting out of debt, however you're choosing to take care of that, whether it's bankruptcy or debt consolidation or any of those things, that is such a gift to yourself. That is a path forward in healing. And I think the more people that are out there who can guide people through that healing process, the more people will be able to let go and build those good financial habits going forward, especially, if it was a fault of their own versus not so much of a fault of their own, and really be able to place blame where blame belongs.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that, and this is one thing I go through with my bankruptcy clients and doing a cash flow analysis and saying, okay, you know, this is your net income coming in, this is what it cost you, and I really make them give me some hard numbers, not guesses, and say, all right, this is the money that's coming in, this is the money that's going out, this is how much you're spending. And the number of times they've said, wow, I didn't realize I was spending that much on this, and just helping them, and not in a negative sense of waving a finger or anything else, to say, hey, this is how you got here, or this is a good part of how you got here, and they have a better understanding of how they got here. And I said, not only do I need to do this analysis for the bankruptcy to show that you're insolvent, to show that you really can't afford to pay your debts, but this is the wake up call. This is the adjustment of understanding how much you spend and how much comes in. So that going forward, you have a better sense of the path you need to be on to keep that fresh start. And if you're negative, if you're deficit spending, you've got to address that, or you're just going to be in another hole in another few months. So, in your practice, do you find that when people have a better understanding of how they got into the problem, does that help? I guess with the guilt, that it explains how it's not their fault, or at least how they can make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, what it does, my sessions definitely include a pretty significant educational component.
Mm-hmm.
When the majority of Americans, don't have any kind of formal personal financial, education, I think that is something, we do have to address and help them with the tools that they can add to their financial toolkit that will, enhance and encourage them and give points of reference in terms of growth and transformation moving forward with their personal financial journey, whether there's debt included in that or not.
Mm-hmm.
um it's a must have. People, I think it's really hard for people to, or for anybody really, when somebody points out, maybe a vulnerability or a weakness. Sometimes, there can be some defensiveness there, but it's all about the delivery and how you choose to, you know, form those those arguments, or those pointing out things, um, because you do have to frame it in a way, like, most people are not aware of this, and so much of our spending and our money habits often go on autopilot, and I know we were talking a little bit earlier before we started about technology and how wonderful it is, right? But it can also make it really easy for us to miss things, like, things are on subscriptions, we're submitted to, marketing and advertising dollars, and there's tech micro boundaries that probably should be put in place, when it comes to spending, and all of these things wrap it up. But when you can, collaborate, with people in a collaborative, egalitarian type of playing field, it makes a huge difference in the way they feel about themselves. They feel like they're with somebody who's on their side, and with a teacher, not somebody who's talking at them, telling them that they're a terrible person, which is, I think, one of the bigger issues in personal financial, planning guidance and advice. Is a lot of that advice is very black and white, and it's also very shame inducing.
Mm-hmm.
And when people feel shame, they're going to shut down.
Mm-hmm. Well, how do you see, and I've talked about this in the podcast and other episodes, but how do you see mindset as coming into this? People have a particular mindset or attitude or outlook towards money, and to what extent that contributes to the situation that they're in, and whether they need to change that outlook or that mindset going forward.
Yeah, so some people have a really, solid mindset. They're very, like, hey, things happen. I'm not going to beat myself up too bad about this. I'm going to plug the holes, fix what I need to fix, and I'm going to move forward. Those are, I would say, probably the easier clients, right? But a lot of people, most people, have areas of, you know, growth potential. And so there are a lot of people who come in with, these ideas that they're just generally bad with money.
Mm-hmm.
And for people who are, filing bankruptcy, or in a debt, situation, or just can't control their spending, or have a hard time budgeting, there's a lot of statements I hear that are deeply rooted in shame.
Mm-hmm.
And shame really shows up as I am a mistake, and guilt shows up as, well, hey, I made a mistake. And so mindset, you can also see the way mindset plays into that, because the people who have a little bit stronger mindset around their personal finances and what they can or cannot do, they generally move forward pretty easily, and they carry a lot more guilt than the shame. But the people who are struggling with, the sense of helplessness or hopelessness, or panic, or that stress, they're generally carrying a lot of ideas or beliefs around money that, hinder their growth going forward. And a lot of that, starts in childhood, and those ideas and thoughts are formed, on life experiences, both experienced by them directly and indirectly. And so bringing attention to those things in my sessions is very paramount, and helping people understand, where they're at, where they're coming from, give them a point of reflection, and give them a place to start, so they can start, unraveling their money beliefs, and make them make sense for them, with a new set of values that reflects their values, instead of the values of other people that can induce shame.
Well, let's get a little bit more granular here. We've been talking about debt in general and people in general. So look at debt, and specifically with credit card debt. How does that impact specifically someone's mental health?
Oof. Well, I think credit card debt, is particularly insidious, and it has a very particular sting, because it tends to grow pretty silently and pretty quickly. A lot of people find themselves being able to manage it, and then all of a sudden they can't. And we can think compounding interest and fees and things like that for creating that hamster wheel or treadmill type of effect. And when the debt becomes too much, people make payments, but of course they then feel like they're getting nowhere, because if you're paying minimum payments on credit cards or multiple credit cards, we've seen the numbers on that. It can take decades to pay off. And what that then creates obviously is this cycle of hopelessness and fear and an uncertainty of what's going to happen in the future. The I am bad with money, I'm never going to get out of this. And I see that almost every single day in my work. They internalize it to the point where it's like I'm just never going to get ahead.
Mhm.
And then that can do two things. It can either fuel additional spending, like just doesn't matter what are they going to do, or complete financial paralysis, where you have the isolation, you've got the shame, and you just don't know what to do. It just this chronic stress of being stuck in a loop that you can't get out of.
Mhm. And as you're talking about it, I'm thinking that really um, different types of debt can act differently. For example, medical debt. If you have a
Mhm.
lot of medical debt, well, it's not like you're irresponsible or you
No,
feel irresponsible. You got sick, you were in a car accident, you whatever happened that required medical services that you can't afford now.
right.
I would think that you would have less guilt about that or self blame because it's really external. If you bought a car and it was ended up being repossessed and they're coming after you for the difference, well, you need a car for work. Maybe you bought a car that was a little too much for you, but you figured you could you have a fixed monthly payment, and something happened that got that out of hand. But with credit card debt, that's something that I think people might blame themselves a lot more for because, hey, I used the credit card too much. I let it run up. I didn't pay it off. Would you say that the type of debt is linked to the level of self blame?
Yes, in my observations, yes. In the years I've been doing this and what I've observed with my clients anecdotally, absolutely. That tracks. I think people do feel like they have a little bit more control over their credit card debt. You can't control whether or not you get diagnosed with, stage 4 breast cancer, right?
Right,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, like and I think there is a level of detachment that happens from that. Or, yes, just the short answer is yes. Credit card debt, like I said, though, like it makes people feel like that they are the ones who did it. But it's so interesting that you bring up medical debt. Is I worked with a client a couple years ago who made great money. I mean, we're talking upper six figures, had health insurance, but had a number of kids, and one of those children was diagnosed with a pediatric cancer. And between feeding 4 kids and house cleaning and all of those things, the family is falling apart trying to keep one of theirs alive, right? A lot of credit card expenses were the consequence of that. And so there's that. I know I probably shouldn't have used my credit card for these expenses, but when we're trying to get kids around and kids fed because we're working around treatment, and next thing you know, we're spending $100 every day eating out. There's that logical part, right, that says maybe this isn't a good idea, but then there's that emotional place where it's like I don't feel like I have any other choice.
Mhm.
And so there's often situations where it's kind of a combination.
Mhm.
And when there's a combination there's also an interesting, I think, conflict that happens, mentally and emotionally. Like, I know why I did it. I don't necessarily regret why I did it, but now I have to deal with it. And I still feel like I could have done differently, even though my life circumstances really couldn't have afforded me that from a mental health perspective.
Mhm. And there's a debate now going on. There a while back, it was ruled that medical debt should be on a credit report, and I always thought that that was a good idea because that's not an indication of your credit worthiness, of how responsible you are with debt, how you handle debt. This is not something that was incurred voluntarily. This is not something where you knew you were buying X for $500 and you bought it and now you got to pay for it, pay the credit card bill. Medical services are really the only area I know of in which parties enter into an agreement. You'll render the service and I'll pay you for that service without ever agreeing on how much it'll cost. So, how can it be financially irresponsible of you to incur medical debt when you didn't know at the time how much it was going to be?
Yeah,
So, I don't think it should be on. And some say, well, it's it could be debt to income ratio, it could be this that, and the other thing, but none of those things, debt to income ratio or things like that, impact a FICO score.
mhm,
So why should medical debt be on there? And I think that sort of recognizes the fact that this isn't your fault. This isn't you being bad with credit.
absolutely. I mean, you get a $2 million bill. I mean, what are you gonna do with that, right?
And sometimes you got to question it. My
Yeah.
my my wife just got a bill. She was in a rehab physical therapy. I hate to say rehab, a physical therapy center, and we gave them the insurance information, and they sent us a bill for $1,500 months after she was discharged from the facility. I'm like, where does this come from? What's going on? Well, it turned out they never billed the secondary insurance. I'm like,
Interesting.
wait a minute. You know, you you billed the primary one, and there was a copay, but you never went to the secondary to see what they would pay. And people get bills and don't realize, wait a minute, it's not necessarily correct just because they billed
Right.
you for it.
Right. Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
but we're getting a little far afield. Like we said, we're talking about granularity and breaking this up a little bit. Um, what financial differences do you see when it comes to age or gender and you're working with clients? Are there differences between male and female, boomer and millennial?
Yes, to all of the above. We're all different. But yes, I think I'll start with gender differences. I do think, what I see is that, women, I think, are the more guilty feeling parties. There's a lot of mom guilt or grandma guilt, that shows up a lot. Women often face more pressure around, financial caretaking, whether that's with children or aging parents, or if you're in a sandwich generation, you get a little bit of A and B. Um, but, it comes in terms of both, spending and feelings of maybe not being able to provide, but not only financially, but also emotionally, your bandwidth kind of shrinks in both ends. So I see that with women quite a bit. The other thing I see with women is, women are invested in things like investing. They're good with their money. They manage finances well. The majority of them do. But there is still a little bit of lack of confidence when it comes to investing behaviors and being able to, feel really good about that without kind of second guessing yourself.
Mhm,
Um, Men on the other hand, they're often burdened, of course, with those expectations of, financial performance and success. And so when they struggle, it can feel like a direct hit to their identity. Um, and those differences, also impact how people experience and talk about money and debt and finances in general and how they heal from it.
mhm,
I think there's this perception that, women are inherently more emotional. We like to chat a little bit more. And I think that's true to a certain degree. But, in my experience, in my practice, the men, are also ready to have these conversations about their experiences and be able to talk about them a little bit more openly, because I do feel like there's just this tremendous amount of pressure to, you know, hold up a family or, be the proverbial breadwinner. And I'm not making any sort of commentary on, who's working or who's not in the home. But I mean, just historically speaking, that is the pressure there. Um, and then when it comes to, you know, uh, age differences, with younger clients, in particular when it comes to debt or, kind of correcting, course correcting money issues or things they're struggling with, there's generally this idea that, okay, I've got time to fix this. I'm good. I've got time. I can course correct. I'm going to be okay. My Gen Zer type of clients, they're the ones, of course, who are much more willing to spend on experiences,
mhm,
have a little bit more, more balance of fun and saving in their life compared to maybe the boomer generation, or even, some elder Gen Xers, who, have a very, more kind of strict rule of priorities. And nothing is wrong with either. It's just the differences there. But in particular, my older clients, who are struggling with debt, I generally tend to see them have just this sense of regret that they either, I think you'd mentioned this before, they should have known better, should have done better. But what I hear most often that is just absolutely heartbreaking is I should be further along in life than I am. I probably only have another 10, 15, 20 years to live. And here I am, and I should be enjoying these years, and I can't.
Well, certainly, we still deal with gender-based roles.
Mhm.
A lot of times we focus and I focus with and rightfully so, the feminist movement and everything that we're trying to, as our society changes, we try to break out of these gender-based roles. But I think to some extent we don't realize that men are dealing with gender-based roles there. They're to a great extent, they're the breadwinner. They are the support of the family. And even if both of them work, uh, if he's not able to support them or whatever, there's still that guilt. So that becomes an issue. And age, I'm talking about age and the difference of age. It's not just a number of how old they are, but it's a generational outlook. If you look at certainly with the silent generation and just to the early boomers, what's a credit card?
Mhm.
I don't recall offhand when credit cards became generally available to the public or when people started using them, but
Mhm.
that was a real mindset change where if you didn't have the money to pay for it, you didn't get it, or
Yeah.
you just incurred the debt, like medical debt or whatever it is. There was no such thing as a credit card. There was no way of financing it and paying it off over time using a credit card.
Yeah.
So that sort of mindset or approach to personal finance has changed as technology has changed, right?
Yeah. And I do think, when you look at the evolution of the credit system, and there's a lot of criticisms and things like that, but I really think with credit cards in particular, when our FICO scores, we kind of came front and center, and we needed measures of credit worthiness. Credit cards were really, I think, heavily marketed as a way to, boost your credit worthiness. And that's great. That's fine. But at the same time, there was no, coinciding education that was meaningful in any way that taught people how to use credit cards responsibly. And I will say this with my whole chest. I think that is a failure of the financial services industry as a whole. Um, there's such a danger in credit card usage.
Mhm.
Um, Not just from the financial perspective, but the emotional perspective is really what I'm focused on here. And when you shame people for getting into credit card debt without educating them, I really think that signals a greater problem. And for men, women, and people of all ages, I mean, that's something you just can't escape.
And our educational system, even just through high school, we're
Yeah.
not, and this is something I've discussed in other episodes with other guests. See, we're not educating our youth. When I was in school, the boys took shop and the girls took home ec, but home ec was sewing and cooking and again, breaking into traditional gender-based rules. But there's no home ec to teach boys and girls how to deal with money, how credit cards work, how interest rates work, how loans are financed, things like that, budgeting. This is not taught to them, and more as people are not going to college and they're going out into the world. They're going out unprepared.
Mhm.
And if the schools aren't teaching them, if the parents have bad money habits and aren't passing them on to their children, that's not the child's fault. Nobody ever told them differently, and we're kind of perpetuating the problem by not educating them right. And I agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do have a lot of hope out there. I know there's some states who have passed legislation, saying, hey, we got to put personal finance in schools. And I think that's starting to get underway a little bit more large scale, which is a great thing. But it is really hard to put into practice financial literacy if you have none, or if you don't have support at home. It's just not, at school. It needs to be at home in some way, or with people that can really support you through that process. Because like I said, people find themselves in debt, and a lot of it, has that consequence of shame and isolation. And you know for most people, their personal financial, money journey has largely been on their own. And
Mhm.
so why would it be any different, when you get into a major financial challenge, to try and navigate it alone? But
Mhm.
the ironic thing is there are so many millions and millions of people who are on that debt journey with you, and you don't even know it.
Mhm. So let's, one of the things you talk about in what you do is something called loud budgeting.
Yeah.
What is that, and how does it people, how can people use this as a strategy? I've never heard of loud budgeting. That's a new one
Yeah.
to me.
So, my life's mission is to really just get people to talk about money comfortably, and from an empowering place, a place where it feels inspiring to them, but not only to other people. And so what loud budgeting is that it's naming your financial boundaries out loud. A lot of times, we'll feel some guilt when a friend will ask, "Hey, do you want to go to dinner? You want to go see a movie tonight?" And I can't afford that. No, no. Say something like, I am saving for my future, so I'm not spending on this right now, but can I take a rain check? Or do you want to go find free yoga out at the park? Like, let's flip the script from this place of I need to be ashamed that I can't afford this, or I am on a budget, or any of those things. And let's make it come from an empowering place,
Mhm.
not a place of about what I can't do, but it's about what you're choosing to do differently. And I think part of that choosing is also being a little bit loud about it, to build some self-respect, some good vibes, if you will, reduce that shame, but also share that with other people who are also, maybe feeling that peer pressure to go out or socialize. But the option is either I go out and socialize with my friends to fit in, or I don't have cash, so now I got to put it on the credit card. It's all about choices, right?
Mhm.
And choosing some boundaries, and openly speaking about them, I think also helps other people respect it as well. But it also helps them build their own set of boundaries, and opens up conversations, to where people just by nature will feel less alone. That's what loud budgeting is.
So loud budgeting isn't yelling at your spouse for going over budget on a purchase?
Not if you want to protect the integrity of your marriage.
Because I don't know. I was thinking, well, gee, what could that be? Loud budgeting. So I'm
I don't
glad to
know.
hear that's not what it is.
A situation where loud budgeting or yelling at your spouse is ever a good idea.
All right. So we've talked about the problem and we've talked about some possible solutions. What is your approach to helping folks that come to you?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, my approach is really rooted in combining financial education with those therapeutic and transformational tools. You know,
Mhm.
um, we don't just talk numbers; we explore the emotional stories behind them. I want to know where they came from, but I want to know, I want them to know where they came from. If I see somebody avoiding opening their credit card statement, let's explore the anxiety around that behavior. Where did that come from? Um, did you grow up in a house where, your parents were constantly on edge about the bills that came? Did you see that? Is that where this comes from? Or is it that you've overspent and you don't want to look at it? There's different places where we can play and explore in this, but there's also room to give them, those steps to break that avoidance.
Mhm.
Um, it's very, I come from a very, very, very strong place of encouraging compassion towards themselves, but also taking inspired action. I want them to think about what they're doing in terms of their future self. What would future self do? Present self might not have it all figured out right now, but that's the point. We're all human beings. We're all learning here. But what does future self say? What does future self do? What does future self believe? And giving them those tools to help regulate their emotions and reframe their beliefs in the present, and then create a plan from that is something that they can stick to and feel good about, something that is flexible and creative, that adjusts for their life experiences and changes in values they might have. I don't know about you, but probably the financial values or life values you had at 20 are probably not the values you have now. And there needs to be room for the gray area. Personal finance, like I mentioned, it can be so black and white, and emotions are just messy. So I think if you can kind of play in the gray area of personal finance and get to a place where you understand how your emotions interplay in that gray area, that's where massive healing and transformation can happen.
Mhm. Well, that's great. What kind of you're talking about? What would your future self do? I think that that helps in getting asking that kind of question forces them to think in terms of where they're going, what their goals are,
Mhm.
what future, because future self is going to be better than current self. So things
Yeah,
have got to be better. How do they see what's better? How do they see the future? And that helps you in sort of a feedback loop. If future them isn't quite there yet, then you need to know what you need to tweak in your therapy with them
yeah,
to correct that to get future self in alignment of where they need to be. Right.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So, what kind of results are you seeing after your clients engage with you in these financial therapy sessions? What once they finish, what's life like for them?
So the biggest kind of collective feedback I get is that they have a sense of relief and they have permission to forgive themselves. They have permission to hope again. There's so much hopelessness that comes with being stuck in the cycle of debt, and clients tend to go from feeling stuck and ashamed and then this shame spiral to feeling seen. And when I say feeling seen, I don't necessarily mean by me. They see themselves the way I see them, which are, is somebody who's capable, who's getting help, who's doing all the right things. Even if they can't see it, I can't. But then they start to see themselves the way I see them. And that I think is such a gift for them. But not only that, they feel cared for and they feel supported and they feel empowered. They are able to, open their mail again or, make the phone calls they've avoided. And they move from a place of self sabotage to finding their self-worth again. They're able to separate their self-worth from their net worth. Again, we get so many, you mentioned it earlier, so many of those external messages and notes out there that, equate our credit score, our checking account, or all of those things to a value of who we are as a person. And they make that shift from I am my debt to I am more than my debt. And that is life changing.
So, and since your what you're dealing with is different than what I'm dealing with as a bankruptcy attorney, where I try to use a lot of what you talk about to make them feel better
Mhm.
and to make them realize they're taking the right step. But when they're finished, once I've done my job, they've got a fresh start. The debt doesn't exist.
Right.
With you, and this isn't a criticism, but you don't. You're teaching them a better way to deal with
Mhm.
the stress and everything that comes with the debt, so that they can start addressing it without all of this weight on their shoulders of guilt, of
Yeah.
lack of self worth, and everything else, and that makes it easier for them to then get a handle on their debt and move forward.
Absolutely. I think it's about this. Again, going back to the choice thing. There's so many choices you can make when it comes to the act of getting out of debt.
Mhm.
Um, and it could be taking the route of bankruptcy. For so many people, that is such a relief and such a good choice. You know what I mean? And I'm sure you've seen plenty of that. And for others, it's going through a debt consolidation program, or maybe for somebody, it's just chipping away at their debt, depending on what that looks like and what they can manage. From an income perspective. I mean, there's so many different paths forward. But when you are in the big emotions of debt, when you are feeling that shame, where you have maybe that financial paralysis or the financial decision making paralysis, things aren't clear.
Mhm.
And you can't see a path forward until that dust settles. And I see a lot of my work being just kind of that big fan that gets the dust blown away so they can see that clear path forward. Brene Brown is probably one of my favorite authors. She's a great researcher on shame, but she has this phrase and I love it. And she says, clear is kind. And the more clear somebody can get on their path forward, the kinder that is to themselves. And it is both twofold. It is understanding your emotions, it's understanding how you're engaging with your experience and your self-worth. And it's also the tangible, how do I make the numbers work to get out of this, and what path do I choose, and who are the people I can choose to be on my side to walk me through this, whatever path I do end up choosing. They get the power of choice, and people need to be reminded that they are not the sum of their past financial choices, but if they're with you or with me, or doing something else, they're making good financial choices. And I want to remind people of that. Deciding to take one path to take care of your debt is no better or no worse than any other path, but it's a financial choice, and you're making a financial choice, and trust yourself and trust that process.
Mhm. Okay, well, great. If folks, listeners out there want to get in touch with you, feel that they could benefit from your services to relieve a lot of this stress and get them to a clear-headed place where they could deal practically with their debt, how can they reach out to you? What do you offer?
A great place to connect with me is on LinkedIn. That's the only social media I've got.
Okay.
But LinkedIn is a place to go, so feel free to send me a message there. And if you want to check out some of the work I do at Beyond Finance, you can go to beyondfinance.com and check out financial wellness over there.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, Dr. Erica, thanks for coming on the show and telling us about this important issue that I see all the time in my bankruptcy practice, and hopefully, I make people filing bankruptcy feel better. Or at least I hope I do, and hopefully, you're making people feel better that go on to deal with their debt without having to file bankruptcy,
Yeah.
which is always a good thing.
Yes.
So, thanks for coming on the show and giving us all this great information.
Thank you so much for having me.